Just as we're moving in, everybody, can you maybe just squeeze into the middle of the row?
I'm here to help when you need it most. Coordinating your care, listening to and supporting you and your loved ones through your recovery. And this is how you treat me?
Up to 95% of our healthcare workers have experienced verbal or physical assault. No matter what the situation, it's never okay.
Welcome to the second keynote speech of today's session, and welcome back to those who've already been here today. But I think numbers have increased, so good to see. So welcome to those who have come along. Watching that's difficult, isn't it? And I still shake my head and can't believe that happens. But sadly, it does happen. And it's just never okay. We know that. We certainly know that. As I said, welcome to what is the last event of Health and Safety Month for WorkSafe Victoria. Our next speaker is going to be a fantastic speaker for what has been the focus of Health and Safety Month this year on mental well-being, mental health and well-being in the workplace. He's got a lot of experience in that area and he's going to talk about it. For those who are new to this session, just to reintroduce myself, my name's Cameron Ling. I'm one of the ambassadors for Health and Safety Month in my second year, and it's an absolute pleasure to be a part of a really important month for WorkSafe Victoria. A month that travels all around Victoria, regional Victoria, lots of visits, lots of free seminars, lots of free workshops to help as many people, both employers and workers, stay safe in the workplace. We know that too many people get injured and sadly die on the workplace still. Even one is too many. So WorkSafe Victoria is doing a great job, and this month has been a really important month for them. Just to go back through some of the housekeeping before I introduce our next speaker, there will be questions at the end of the speech from Lindsay Tanner, and I encourage all of you to jump on to social media and using the hashtag that's up there on your screen, hashtag HS Month. Also, if you have any pictures, I know we've been taking a few pictures, or you've got any comments, please use the hashtag. But any questions at the end, use that hashtag, or please use the SMS number 0429 117 085 to fire in the questions. And for those who were in the last session, there were a heap of questions, unfortunately, that I didn't get to ask both Claire and Catherine. I can assure you, I have been assured, that those questions aren't just chucked in the rubbish bin. They are passed on to WorkSafe and they are collated together, and they will help WorkSafe to formulate next year's Health and Safety Month and throughout the year. So those questions are all important. They will be passed on to WorkSafe Victoria to make sure that a lot of your questions are being answered, and we can tailor some of the workshops to those questions if they are extremely important ones, which I'm sure they are. Please, those who haven't, turn your mobile phones onto silent or vibrate or off, so we show respect to our next speaker. And in the event of an emergency, the venue and the venue staff will direct us to the nearest evacuation assembly area. Let's hope we don't need to do that, but as always, health and safety is an absolute priority. The next speaker that I have the pleasure of introducing is a man who has done a lot of things and he's still doing a lot of things, so we'll speak from great experience. Lindsay Tanner was a member of the Australian Parliament for 18 years and Minister for Finance during the global financial crisis, when Australia was one of the very few developed nations not to go into recession. Since leaving politics in 2010, Lindsay has undertaken senior roles across the entire breadth of Australian society. He works as Special Advisor to corporate advisor Lazard Australia, which specialises in mergers and acquisitions and privatisation advice. He's an adjunct professor at Victoria University, serves as a director of a small international airline, sits on the advisory board of a major global bulk shipping company, chairs the Mitchell Institute for Health and Education Research, and is president of one of Australia's largest, oldest and most famous sporting clubs, Essendon Football Club. I'm starting to think I'm a bit lazy and don't do enough work when you read all that out. It's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage now Lindsay Tanner. Lindsay.
Thanks very much, Lee. I'm a bit daunted by what you just read out as well. For those of you who are questioning my credentials to speak on the subject of mental well-being in the workplace, I would point out that I did spend many years of my life in the most psychologically unhealthy workplace in Australia, Federal Parliament. So one thing I can assure you is I definitely know what bad looks like. However, slightly more seriously, I did start my professional career as a personal injuries lawyer at a firm called Holding Redlich. And interestingly, in those days, and I did common law as well as workers' compensation, and in those days, cases about mental injuries and mental illness were not unknown, but were fairly rare. It was very much a physical world. Things have changed in a whole lot of ways. I've, in more recent times, had, of course, some very significant experience as president of Essendon Football Club dealing with the fallout from our supplements program disaster around 2012-2013, in particular the mental health implications that has had, particularly for the affected players. I've also had some very interesting experiences serving on the First Principles Review into the Department of Defence, which is not about mental health issues per se, but has a central component about workplace behaviours and culture and organisation, all of which ultimately are very important in the context of mental health issues for people working in an organisation. There's a range of themes that no doubt will be discussed today about the broad picture issue of mental health in the workplace context. I essentially want to leave you with one message today, and that is that we have come a very long way as a society on these issues, including in the workplace context, but by and large we still tend to see them in organisations through what I would call an individual lens. So we still have essentially a largely reactive way of looking at things. We tend to focus on where something's gone wrong or where an individual is in difficulty, but we don't often enough think about systems, processes, how the organisation runs, how it sees itself, and proactively how it ensures that it provides a safe workplace in a psychological sense as well as in a physical sense. There's been a lot of good things happening, and it is important that we collectively acknowledge those things. Issues like workplace stress, harassment, bullying, mistreatment of a variety of kinds have moved into the mainstream of our public discourse. More and more managements are taking responsibility for dealing with these issues and taking responsibility for the well-being of their employees in a total sense. One of the places that I work, my main day job at Lazard, a global company, has a very sophisticated employee assistance program that's made available for anybody who's got any kind of difficulties, it's well structured, entirely confidential, and it's treated sufficiently seriously that we had a compulsory lunch exercise a couple of months ago with a presentation about exactly what the program entails, how it works. Now, I say that not to pat Lazard on the back, but just to indicate that reasonably sophisticated things are now happening, which in many cases weren't happening in the past. Interestingly, in Australia in the last few years, we've seen CEOs of major companies sacked because of their workplace behaviour and the fact that they were shouting at people, intimidating people, behaving in unacceptable ways, even though their scoreboard result in terms of financial bottom line was basically exemplary. So a changing attitude picture is gradually working its way through organisations in this country. We also are getting better at dealing with employees who have some kind of mental health issue or problem or external trauma that isn't originating in the workplace, but is something that clearly is affecting them and their whole life, and by definition, their life at work. An interesting example that we had at Essendon only a few weeks ago, a long-standing and very valued staff member sadly was on the receiving end of a double tragedy in his personal life. And with his active agreement, a morning tea was organised for all the staff for him to talk about that and what it meant, how it was affecting him, how he was dealing with it. And the unstated objective was to try and spare him the recurrent pain of having all of his workmates one by one over the next few weeks come up to him and ask him, how are you dealing with this tragedy? Well-meaning though it might be, but inevitably just reinforcing the pain every time it's asked. A sign of an organisation that's actually thinking about the well-being of people who work there and taking some responsibility for dealing with things that are externally driven. There's a lot more focus on the interface between work and non-work lives. Work-life balance is a cliche that's almost going into disrepute, but nonetheless, at least it's good that we're talking about it. In a lot of places that I'm associated with, it tends to be more honoured in the breach. It's a very difficult thing to deal with, but at least it is on the screen as a question that we need to look at. Staff engagement surveys are now common in larger organisations, and they're becoming more sophisticated. And the better organisations, and I try and drill this in at Essendon, where we have what I think is quite a valuable tool to understand the sentiment and the broad picture of how people are feeling in our organisation, that this is not designed to be a pat on the back. You don't look at a staff engagement survey looking for the great scores and conveniently ignore the ones that don't look so good. You do the reverse, because it's a good potential early warning symbol of parts of your organisation or particular groups of people or particular circumstances that may be incubating mental well-being problems for individual staff. These things are good potential canaries in the coal mine if structured well and used appropriately. But while the kind of individual approaches that we've seen to great positive effect, like the mindfulness program, positive psychology, which has been used to great value at Essendon, Are You OK? There's a range of different things that are now available to organisations, and I'd certainly recommend to any of you that aren't using those kind of things that you should. By themselves, they're not enough. And in particular, it's really important that managements and boards don't develop a kind of outsourcing mentality. The last thing we want to see is leaderships of organisations in this country treat these issues in the way that they tend to treat things like IT, as something to be handballed to a bunch of boffins who go away and do their boffin stuff, and you get on with doing what you do. There's a critical message here, and that is that managements, leaderships of organisations have actually got to take responsibility for these questions and immerse themselves in those issues and regard them as central to their role in the organisation, not something that is just passed over to a specialist that you can suitably ignore. Organisations, employers need to take responsibility for the overall social and human relationship environment that they control. Because for most of us, a very substantial proportion of our work, of our overall life, is about work. Whether we are physically at a workplace or not, for most of us, it is the dominant thing that drives what we do, where we are, what time we get out of bed, all of those things. So employers need to take on board the responsibility that goes with that inevitably what happens in that part of our life is going to have a big influence on our mental state. And particularly if there are other issues or questions that have nothing to do with work, then there's an added responsibility to try and minimise the negative effect that work may have and that the workplace context may have on how people are doing. This isn't easy. There's an old cliche which I'm sure many of you are very aware of, which is that what gets measured gets managed. So it's not that hard for firms to have LTI indicators and to measure things like physical injuries, how they're doing and whether they're tracking improvement, decline, whatever. It's quite a lot harder. It can be done, but it's inevitably fuzzier to track how your organisation is doing with respect to the mental well-being of your own staff and the people working in the place. Inevitably, that entails grappling with these loose concepts like culture and morale, which will inevitably be in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent and very susceptible to misconception, to distortion, to not understanding what's going on. And there are all kinds of tricky things now emerging for managements. I'm sure that other clubs like us watched the departure of 2 senior male staff members in the AFL recently, associated with personal relationships connected with the workplace, and started to wonder exactly what our protocols are, where do the lines get drawn, how do we both take responsibility for appropriate behaviour and relationships in the workplace without unduly intruding into the individual circumstances and lives of the people who happen to work here. So more and more these things are getting very, very difficult for managements. But there are some key underlying themes that we can all take on board. You'll never get it perfect. Organisations that I'm part of, if I went through these issues, I'm sure in a number of instances I would conclude, you would conclude, that improvement was necessary. But to look at it in an overall picture rather than a responding, reacting, dealing with problems, specific individuals picture, these are some of the things that a responsible leadership has to take on board. Firstly, you have to be proactively committed to people feeling that they are valued and rewarded, that their efforts are noticed, and that to the extent that they are criticised or disciplined, that the message is always, we are doing this because we want you to get better, because we think you are a valuable contributor, we want you to be here, but we think it's important you get better in this particular way. Those people who have to do relatively monotonous or unsatisfying work, think of ways to break that up. Think of ways to vary their responsibilities. Think of ways to give them opportunities to take on more senior activities or to take on more responsibility. Make opportunities available and be thinking about where each individual is potentially heading in their workplace life, and do everything you can to ensure that the opportunity for a positive trajectory is there in front of them. They understand that. They understand that it's not going to be given on a plate, but they understand that there is a sense that their employer actually thinks about them and has aspirations for them. Be frank about strengths and weaknesses. Many years ago, I used to do a lot of unfair dismissal cases as a union official. The number of times that I encountered people who were absolutely blown away when they were sacked and completely blindsided, and yet the employer felt that they had, there were all these notes on the personnel file and stuff. The employer felt that they had been suitably warned and counselled, when sometimes counselling about, for example, turning up to work late would consist of passing somebody in the corridor and saying, "Oh, gee, sorry, we're early." The old line. And in the employer's mind, this was a clear message to the employer: your late timekeeping is not appreciated and you're in potential trouble if it keeps up. Whereas to a normal person receiving that message, you'd barely notice it or you'd laugh it off. So be frank and open and professional and respectful in dealing with people, because if you don't, the odds are pretty high that the issue that you're overlooking will eventually send things off the rails. Handle complaints respectfully and appropriately. I would hope that in most organisations these days that is what happens, but it's not always going to be the case. The behaviour of leaders is crucial. All organisations, to a fair extent, reflect the behaviour of their leader or leaders. So people subliminally absorb the messages every minute of the day from you as a leader about what's valued, what's not valued, what's important, what's going to be rewarded, what's going to be punished, how things are seen. And inevitably they adapt their behaviour to that. So if you behave in certain negative ways, then that will ripple through the organisation. So you have got to set an example in countless tiny ways, and it's not easy. Recognise publicly the importance of each contribution to the total effort of the organisation. Every organisation has a purpose. It's easy for organisations to lose a bit of sight of what that purpose is. It's important that wherever you can, the connection between the work of a particular individual or a particular section of the organisation and the ultimate purpose is reiterated, explained and underlined as important, so that people do have a sense in their working life that they matter, that their contribution is valued, and they can have some degree of ownership of the total outcome. For those who need it, for example, where there are external factors involved, additional support. Don't just take the view that, well, that's stuff that's going on at home, for example, that therefore is not our responsibility. It's not entirely your responsibility, but whether you like it or not, you have a share of that responsibility. I shouldn't need to have to say this, but it's always worth organisations reminding themselves. Favouritism is cancerous, absolutely cancerous. The slightest hint that person X is getting favoured because you drink with them on Friday nights or because they're your second cousin or whatever really erodes not just morale, but the sense of well-being of other people, a sense of the significance of their work, the sense of their life opportunities. And although it's probably not likely to be a direct cause of mental illness, it could be a serious exacerbator. So it's not just about the efficient running of your organisation, it's also about the well-being of your employees, that you behave to the greatest extent you can in an objective and fair manner and avoid favouritism. Done well, these kinds of things will not only maximise your protection in your workplace against the kind of risks that finally are being treated seriously in this area, they will also obviously enhance productivity. So the willingness to go the extra mile as a leader or as somebody who has line responsibilities for these issues, particularly a health and safety manager, being prepared to go the extra mile has got obvious benefits. What's been missing, though, in this area is an overarching frame or concept that gives organisations a reference point. So if we're thinking about bottom line issues like productivity, like our cost structure, all of the usual things that organisations have to worry about, the balance sheet, there's a whole lot of well-established, well-understood measurements and frameworks that enable us to understand how well or badly we're doing, where we need to improve, what's working, what's not working, all those things. One of the critical problems in this area is that we're a bit groping in the dark. We sort of understand what's good and what's not good and what is likely to produce or to exacerbate negative outcomes for the psychological, mental well-being of our own employees. But by and large, we don't have a wider framework that we can hang those judgments off, which means that there is always going to be a high risk that we will lose sight of things, that we'll make arbitrary or capricious decisions, that we'll do really well in one area but completely overlook another area. It is always important, whatever the issue, to have some kind of principled framework that is your reference point that guides how you go about dealing with particular challenges, issues, or strategies for improvement. Now, for a number of years, I've been working with a British organisation called the Relationships Foundation, which has worked very hard on this very question, not just in a workplace context, but more broadly. But its insights and its models are particularly appropriate to organisations, particularly larger organisations, and a huge amount of progress has been made in developing tools that enable organisations to address the question of the health of their relationships, because that's ultimately what's at the core of these issues here. Organisations are simply groups of people brought together in a particular structure to pursue an objective. They're just a bunch of human beings acting collectively to achieve some outcome. And the health of their relationships internally within whatever that group is, whether it's 10 people or 10,000, and their relationships externally with customers, clients, suppliers, anybody who has a relationship with the organisation, the health of those relationships is absolutely fundamental to the success or otherwise of the organisation. Now, this is at one level a truism. We all live for our relationships, we all place family relationships, loved ones, our marriages and everything of equivalent nature, we all place those things centrally in our lives. And it's no different in an organisational situation, that the bottom line is critical, but it's ultimately the quality and health of the relationships in the organisation that determine its success and heavily influence the well-being of the individuals who are part of those relationships. So the tools that the Relationships Foundation has developed, and I'll just give you a bit of a snapshot of these things. I'd encourage you to Google either Relationships Global, Relationships Foundation. There's a variety of iterations of this. It's based in Cambridge in the UK, headed by a bloke who comes out to Australia quite often and speaks in a range of forums, Dr. Michael Sluter, who's a very inspirational guy. But the 5 key indicators of the health of a relationship that this organisation developed are directness, continuity, multiplexity, parity, and commonality. And what do these things mean? Directness. How much face-to-face contact is there? How much human interaction is there? And how much transparency and responsiveness is there in the relationship? Continuity. Is this a relationship that lasts a week and maybe has one or two interactions and that's it? The people or groups of people never see each other again, or is there an ongoing point of connection that keeps resurfacing? It's stating the obvious that there is a fundamental difference between a relationship of the first kind and a relationship of the second kind. Multiplexity. Do you deal with the other party in the relationship at a number of levels? Or is the relationship completely restricted to the one channel, whether it's customer and business or whatever? And here's a classic illustration for employers. One of the great little bits of insight that I got from the Relationships Foundation early in the connection was advice to employers, to the big boss. The best strategy you've got for managing your internal relationships, get your coffee where your staff get theirs. Literally. Because what that will do is trigger informal, equal communications about anything from the weather, the football, people's kids, the fact that their husband's sick or whatever, and it will broaden the relationship, build more trust, build more interaction, and most importantly, more understanding. So multiplexity, try and have relationships that are more than just at a purely functional, transactional level, but are a bit three-dimensional. Parity. Power imbalances are obviously pretty deadly for the quality of relationships. So to ensure, wherever you can, that there is a degree of balance or parity in the relationship is a critical factor in a positive relationship. And finally, commonality, purpose. So if there's a common purpose, then everybody is more likely to have a healthy relationship, particularly if it's properly understood. A whole lot of tools have been developed by the Relationships Foundation to pursue those objectives. For example, the concept of a relational audit, which they developed in tandem with KPMG, where the equivalent of a financial audit is done of a largish organisation like a government department or a big company to get a sense of how various parts of the organisation see each other, how they connect with each other, what the quality of the relationship is. And although this tool wasn't used in our work in the Defence Department, it probably should have been, because one of the key findings of our inquiry there was that in the Defence Department, at the time, it is now changing and doing great things, but at the time when we did this inquiry initially a few years ago, hardly anybody saw themselves as working for the Department of Defence. They worked for the Army or for Landed Estate or IT and tended to see other bits of the organisation with, at best, indifference and in some cases as the enemy. Now, I would hope that people potentially invading Australia would be seen as the enemy by people working in defence, but that wasn't always the case. And that was all ultimately about poor relationships at an organisational level. The other tools that the organisation, the Relationships Foundation, has developed include things like relational reporting, which has been mandated in the South African Stock Exchange for the largest companies to actually measure through complex surveys the quality of relationships, not just of staff, but suppliers, customers, to get a picture of the health of the organisation in that regard. So this, I would emphasise, is all work in progress. And although it may seem to be one step removed from the psychological well-being and the safety, the mental well-being and safety of employees, it's ultimately the big picture frame that is going to shape how those issues unfold. And any of you who have the opportunity to contribute to the dialogue, the debate, the thinking that has been going on in various parts of the world about this question at that big picture level, I would encourage you to do so, because that has been the missing bit of the puzzle. That has been the reason why these issues have tended to be neglected, because of the lack of a big picture frame that enables everybody to understand and analyse and measure to at least a reasonable extent how things are going, what's going right, what's going wrong, what needs to be done, where the problems may be. So if you think about, in conclusion, the journey that we have been on as a society over the last 30 or 40 years, from a world where we started to treat physical injuries in the workplace seriously, and I was kind of there at the time in the early 80s as a lawyer when we were starting to progress beyond the concept that said when somebody had their arm torn off, then maybe you'd think about putting a guard on the machine. We kind of grew a bit beyond that. Mental wellbeing issues are in many respects harder for organisations to deal with. They're less discrete in the sense that there's not a separate context. We don't park our brain at the door when we turn up for work, or at least most of us don't, and put in another brain that's the work brain, or our personality, or our overall well-being. So there is a blurring between work and non-work, which is not typically the case when it comes to physical stuff. These issues are harder to measure by definition. But it ultimately boils down to a set of responsibilities for leaderships, for boards, management, to be asking themselves some fairly basic questions, to be paying attention, to be displaying some what I would call organisational emotional intelligence. What are the drivers in our workplace of the mental well-being, to the extent that we influence it, of the people here? What are the drivers? What are the things that shape that mental well-being, positive and negative? How do we assess these things? How do we measure them? How much effort do we make to understand them? What do we do with the results, whether it's staff surveys or any other assessment? What do we do? What analysis do we undertake, and what actions do we undertake? What processes do we have in place that are designed to enhance the well-being, the psychological, mental well-being of our own staff? What defensive measures do we have in place to pick up signs of problems, individual issues, as early as possible? And how do we go about assisting individuals with those problems as early as we can? How do we compare ourselves with our peers? Amongst the other organisations that do the same sort of stuff that we do, are we the best? Are we the worst? What does the comparison look like? If we're clearly not the best, what's the difference between us and the best? What can we be doing that's better? Why do people leave? Why do people come and work here? We just had the interesting experience at Essendon of moving from a club that was losing one or two quality players to other clubs every year for the past 4 or 5 years, to suddenly becoming a club that has managed to attract 3 high-quality players this year. Now that's a huge difference. And although that star talent's probably slightly more important in a football context than your average workplace, it still matters a lot. So what are the psychological shapers of how people feel about our organisation? All of these things should be front and centre for managements and boards, and attention to those issues will help to drive a better workplace, better outcomes in terms of mental well-being for staff. The key message, though, underneath all this is a pretty straightforward one. Take responsibility. We've learned the hard way at Essendon that we've had to take responsibility, and no matter who you are, no matter what organisation you're in, you're a fundamental part of the lives of the people who work there. You've got to take the responsibility that is attached to that and to care about their mental well-being and to actively regard that as a central part of your responsibilities as an organisational leader. At long last, we're starting to realise these things. At long last, organisations are taking these responsibilities on board. They don't necessarily require vast expenditure or leaders to turn themselves into Father Christmas, just to have the decent treatment of people and emotional intelligence at the heart of your mission as a management, as a leader, as a board. To invest in people, to worry about how they're doing, to take responsibility for their overall well-being. It's not really that hard, surely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindsay, for all of that. And just from all the different levels, from leadership, management to workers, about the responsibility of every one of those people to make sure that the culture of any workplace is the best it can possibly be in order to allow people to have the conversations that need to take place to make sure that everybody's mental health and well-being is looked after. We've got plenty of questions coming in, lots of questions for you, Lindsay, which is a good sign. Thank you to those who have been using the hashtag HS-month and also on the text message. Please keep them coming in. We've got about 15 minutes or so we will fire as many of these as I possibly can at you. I will start off with one that's been a fairly regular theme throughout these questions, and I'll just use this one as the best example I can because it sums up a lot of the questions that we've got coming through around those people who don't want to talk up, don't want to share what's going on in their lives. And this question is, how can we assist and support team members who do not want to share the impact their home life is having on their mental health and work in the workplace and performance? So those who are having trouble, as you're talking about, and as said, this is pretty common across a number of questions, who don't want to talk about it at all, how do you help them to talk?
There will inevitably be a proportion of people who nothing will draw them out of their shells on that front, and at one level that needs to be respected. So I'm not one of these people who thinks that if you don't cry there's something wrong with you. So different people have very different ways of dealing with issues, emotional problems and trauma. I think the basic frame that an organisation needs to take to this kind of situation is to make it as easy as possible. So understanding that there will always be some people who nothing will break through, but the next layer on the spectrum, there'll be people who will be hard to get through or through to, and the best way to deal with that is to ask yourself as an organisation, how do we ensure that if there's some chance that they will seek help, talk to someone, share their problems, how do we ensure that in the part of the picture that we're responsible for, their options there are as low risk, low stress, easy as possible for them. But you do have to acknowledge that it's, in many cases, it'll be very, very difficult for all kinds of understandable reasons. But there are huge positive things happening. The fact that you have people like AFL players standing up publicly and saying, I'm taking time off, I'm suffering from depression, is an incredibly powerful legitimising thing that over time will help to break down some of that resistance.
You stay there, Lindsay. I've got my nice little lapel mic here. I'll just keep firing these ones at you. And I suppose another way perhaps is the engagement surveys that you spoke about. The question we've got here is on exactly that, and specifically how, as we hope that one comes up there, what are some of the examples of questions to include on engagement surveys to measure wellbeing in the workplace and to genuinely draw out the type of information that you're talking about to identify what can be done better?
There's a real science in designing surveys, and one of the things as a long-term politician that I became very cynical of is a lot of opinion polls. Most opinion polls about issues are completely meaningless junk and should be not treated very seriously. Longitudinal polls, where you test the same question over an extended period a number of times, that can give you some interesting indicators. So that's the first thing, is that you need to do things over a period of time to get a sense of trends. So no questions on these issues are ever going to be absolutely precise, but the kind of things that are important, things like, do you feel valued by your organisation? Do you understand what the mission is? Do you feel like you've got opportunity? So there's a range of broad indirect questions that will start to tease out a bit of a sense of what the feeling is out there. And some more specific ones like, have you ever experienced or observed things like harassment, bullying, inappropriate behaviour from supervisors or people in positions of authority? Things like that will will start to draw out at least a sense of, oh, we've got a problem in this department, or there's clearly an issue with these particular processes. So you can start to get some indicators that will at least tell you where to look. Now, more precise questions are worth trying, but there is always a risk that you'll get kind of false positives. And one of the great things about surveys and indeed about voting is that people rarely answer the question that's in front of them. So you get a question like Brexit, for example, in the UK. For a very substantial proportion of voters, the question on the bit of paper was not, should we leave the EU? The question was, how are you feeling about things? That's the key question in most elections. And you hold a plebiscite, the Republic plebiscite was a classic example. A very large proportion of people voted about stuff other than what was notionally in front of them. So you've always got that risk. So you've got to treat results with some grain of salt here and just gradually work through it. But at the end of the day, there are professionals, there are HR professionals, survey professionals who do have a pretty good handle on the traps here and how to avoid meaningless outcomes.
Another question coming through on the SMS, which is great, is some team members don't want to know about others' mental health issues or don't know how to deal with it. And I can put my hand up there from a football club perspective. It was this new concept to us. We didn't know how to deal with it. What are some strategies to help them understand mental health issues and be comfortable with it?
One of the things that I think AFL clubs have been outstanding with is where you've got situations with an individual player who's got a problem or an issue, who's messed up or is clearly troubled, to have that player actually stand up and talk to the playing group. And this happens, I'm pretty sure, at all clubs in different ways. And you're talking about guys in their 20s, most of whom will have typical younger male reluctance to talk about these sorts of things. But because they're talking to peers, and it's in my impression managed in a very sensitive and careful way, my impression is that these things have proved very positive, not just for the individual, but also for the understanding of the wider group. So although this will not be successful in all situations and all workplaces, that kind of group discussion where the person actually says, look, I'm in strife because of the following things, you need to understand these things. I don't want you to talk about it, I don't want you to make allowances or whatever, but you just need to understand. That can be a very powerful, positive thing. A lot of the stuff that is happening now, just the are you okay kinds of things, that has a cumulative effect where it is legitimising the question in a sense, and it's making it normal. It's not unusual. So the idea that somebody, a workmate or a friend, has got mental health problems or is struggling is not some big dramatic sort of mega gossip worthy thing. So there's a range of those things of just changing the dynamic, which a sensible employer can pursue. But I think trying to work out ways where people can talk about things, even if it's only in smaller groups, is probably the key.
It's a really good point you make because, as I mentioned at the start of the day, my dad was involved in a very serious workplace accident when he was 19 years of age. That I understood. Being captain of an AFL football club, I didn't understand how to help others to deal with mental well-being, mental health, and some of those steps that you talk about. You can see the improvement there, but certainly in that industry still has a long way to go. I will, and I appreciate you've said you will answer any questions at all, which is very kind of you. On the AFL theme, and you obviously mentioned Essendon, did Essendon Football Club offer ongoing mental health support to all of those players involved around the drug supplement saga?
The answer is yes, and inevitably there's a variety of circumstances and situations and level of interest, and some of the individual players are in Northern Territory now, or Perth, or whatever. Others are still on our list. So it's important to emphasise that one of the things that's been, in some respects, quite challenging for us is that each individual is different and each individual set of circumstances is different. But the answer is very definitely yes. And one of the other things that we're very careful to do is, in the process of negotiation for compensation settlements, was to offer a process that, in effect, to the maximum extent we could, minimise the additional stress and the risk of public kind of discussion about the individual circumstances of players. So we offered up a process that sidestepped the potential publicity and drama and all kinds of prurient interest that a Supreme Court case might involve, the idea being to mimic what would happen with using independent QCs to effectively run it. All of the 34 players accepted that, and the end result was, I think, for both the club and for the players, about as good as you could realistically hope, given that obviously everybody's got different interests and perspectives. So we've been very conscious of these issues. And one of the things, and you would know it better than most, is that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to is that the mental pressure of being an AFL player these days is just unbelievable. And as fans and as supporters, I think it's something that we need to take on board, is that these are a bunch of mostly pretty young guys who are in the public spotlight, who are typically on social media, they're recognised in the street. If they have a bad game, they've got people abusing them and commenting on them, whatever. Imagine how you'd feel. Yes, you'd like the paycheck, and yes, you'd like the fame and whatever, but the pressure that these guys are under is extreme. And so it's something that we as organisations, as clubs, I think need to be devoting more attention to. And for those footy followers in the audience, before you scream at your own players for their perceived failings, just remember these guys are trying to do their best, and they're highly skilled, and we're not all at our best on every day, and they're no different.
Another one coming through on the text message. Lots of great questions. Before I ask, I did mention right at the start that all questions, even if we don't get to them, will be passed on to WorkSafe, absolutely. This one, a great one. How often should we talk formally about mental health in the workplace? Daily, weekly, monthly? How much is too much or not enough?
I think the key question here is how you go about it. Like, the real risk is that if you end up with some kind of regular, scheduled, person X is going to rant at you about mental health for 15 minutes, that most people will tune out or discount it. So I think the time is relevant, but the critical issue is creativity, is how you go about getting the message across and making it interesting, different. But there's some simple rules, like we all respond to stories. So if you start telling people that 17% of Australians have this problem, and people tune out. But if you tell them an individual story and put them in the shoes of somebody else that otherwise they may have disregarded or not thought very much about or thought not very well of, that can be a very powerful thing. So any form of communication that is built on stories is always going to work better than something that is abstract and routine. So stories, and be creative, think of different ways to approach the subject, and try and avoid creating a sense that you're badgering people, you're in their faces or whatever, and make sure that everybody, however cynical some people will inevitably be, understands that you're well motivated, that you're doing this because you actually want them to be mentally well, and maybe you're not getting exactly right how you're going about it, but your motivation is pure.
Last question, unfortunately, just because of time, and a personal one for you, Lindsay. You have so many roles and responsibilities. How do you personally take responsibility for the well-being of the people you oversee? No doubt difficult with time. How do you do that?
Look, I Obviously, being Essendon president means that I sort of oversee a bunch of people, but strictly speaking, the person who carries that responsibility, as it should be, is the CEO. So it's probably easier for me to answer this question by referring back to when I was a minister and I was in charge. I had an office of a dozen or 15 people in, as I described, the most psychologically poor environment in workplace Australia, in federal parliament. I certainly wouldn't claim to have been a model employer, but there's a couple of things. You will not be able to find an ex-staff member of mine who can tell you a time when I yelled at them. Secondly, my approach when somebody had made a serious mistake was basically to allow them to explain what had happened, what they'd done wrong, move straight into remediation mode. So, okay, well, right, you've done this stupid thing. What are we now doing? What's the right way to fix this, minimise damage, etc., without telling them off or abusing them or throwing a tantrum, because I instinctively understood that they were beating themselves up far more than I ever could. And I ended up engendering, I think, a very good level of loyalty and commitment and work ethic because of just a bit of forbearance on those fronts. It's not easy to, once or twice to sort of show people the door, so sometimes that does have to happen, but there are ways you can do that are professional, caring and constructive, or there are other ways. So there's just a whole lot of small things, and one or two of my colleagues used to communicate with staff members who are literally about 3 metres away from them by email. Now, call me an old-fashioned dinosaur, but I sort of thought, this is a bit strange. So I would try and walk around the office, just engage informally with people, and create the maximum amount of opportunity to just chat that I could. Having said all that, it's an incredibly stressful, time-poor environment, so I have no doubt that one of my deficiencies was that I tended to be very, terse is probably slightly too strong a word, but wasn't interested in undue chit-chat, like bang, what's the issue, right, work this, work that, so on. But individuals vary, so I doubt there's a template that we can apply because we've all got different personalities. My basic personality is essentially a fatalistic one that assumes that crap is going to happen and is pleasantly surprised every now and then when it doesn't. And that's not a bad starting point because it means that I can roll with the punches, and when things don't go according to plan, my instinctive response is, okay, well, that's not working out well, what are we going to do? Be forward-looking, constructive, positive in the way you approach relationships with those that you are in charge of. But there is a reality to these hierarchical relationships that you can't avoid. That you're also responsible for them delivering a quality performance and contributing substantially to the wider outcome. So you can't avoid the hard conversations and the hard decisions, but there's a way that you can go about those things which will minimise gratuitous negative consequences.
Well, really appreciate you coming here today. If all of you could just put your hands together again for Lindsay Tanner. Thank you, Lindsay. Good luck with next year's football season too, Lindsay. I did mean that. Through slightly gritted teeth. But no, thank you very much for coming here today and sharing all of that, so much knowledge, so much experience, and I could see people busily taking notes there and a lot of questions. They will be collated, as I said, through WorkSafe, and it will form a lot of the decisions around next year's Health and Safety Month. I did see a lot of people nod their heads when you said that people were sending emails to their colleagues 3 metres away. I think that happens in a few workplaces, but no, I really appreciate your time, Lindsay. Really appreciate everybody coming along and listening. We're going to have a quick break in a second. Just before you do go, if you could, we love feedback at WorkSafe Victoria. So please either take a photo of that, scan the QR code, or jump onto the website and give us some feedback around any of the talks that you hear today if you've been to other events throughout the month, any of them events throughout the month, throughout Health and Safety Month, please, plenty of feedback. The questions have been much appreciated, and both Claire, Catherine and also Lindsay's answers have been really informative. So I'm going to leave you now. You're all going to have a little break. You're going to come back here with some more information for you for the rest of today. But go and grab a coffee, grab a cup of tea, go to the bathroom. We'll be back here in about 20 minutes' time. Thank you.